Okay, I'm going to get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the JCT Classics webinar, Making Connections Across the Classics Strand. And I want to thank you all very much for tuning in this evening. So, to get started, my name is Ciara Byrne, and I work with JCT as the team leader for Classics. And I'm really looking forward to taking you all through this Classics webinar this evening. So you will have an opportunity to play this webinar back with your colleagues in time, as the webinar will be recorded and uploaded to the website, so www.jct.ie. And alongside this, you will find all of the Classics related material, including the key documents, as well as slides and support materials relating to the CPD workshops that have been offered to teachers to date. On top of this, I'd like to invite you to follow JCT Classics on Twitter to stay up to date with all of our information. And furthermore, if you have any questions that aren't addressed during this webinar, or if you have any queries after this point, please email them to info@jct.ie and you will get a response there. So, for those of you who have never attended a webinar before, this is how your screen would have looked when you logged in earlier. And if you press that orange tab on the right, you could open and close the sidebar, and the sidebar is where you will find some of the facilities you can use throughout this webinar. One of those facilities is the questions function in the sidebar, so you can ask questions and provide comments when prompted throughout. There is a number of points built into this session for answering questions posed, but please do feel free to add them throughout the session. And as I said, any questions not answered as part of this webinar, I will be able to follow them up with an email answer shortly afterwards. So to get started, I want to get an idea of who our audience is tonight, and I'm going to conduct a quick poll to provide an opportunity for me to gather some insight into who is tuned into this webinar this evening. So I'm looking to find out which JCT Classics CPD events you have attended to date. So have you been to a JCT Classics Cluster Day? Is this webinar your first JCT Classics event? Or maybe you're not a Classics teacher and you're just tuning in to hear about developments within the subject this evening. So I'm going to launch the poll now, and I'm going to give you a few seconds to answer. So it should be coming up on your screen. Now, if there's a blue box, if you select one of your answers, and I'll give you a few seconds and we'll have a look at some of the results. Okay, just going to give it a few seconds and then I'm going to close the poll. Okay. It's actually a 50-50 split between people who this is their first, this elective webinar is their first JCT Classics event, and people who have attended JCT Classics Cluster Day 1. So at CPD Day 1, you'll see some of the information regarding the specification is in here, but we're going to go further into the idea of planning. For those of you who this is your first ever thing that you've attended, for those of you who this is the first thing that you've attended, there will be plenty of information here as well. Okay, so I'm going to close that poll out. So what we're looking at this evening is gaining an understanding of the Classic specification, deepening our understanding of and designing units of learning, considering factors that might influence how we plan in long term, and explore possible ways of thinking or of linking units of learning across the strands. So with that in mind, if we have a look at the framework for junior cycle slide here, you may be familiar with this already from other JCT training events. As students experience the principles, the statements of learning, and the key skills across their program through subjects, short courses, and other areas of learning or other learning experiences. So where does Classics fall within this framework? And Classics at the moment would sit in the subject space, and it would feed into the assessment and reporting cycle in your school. So classics in your curriculum. So the elements of the curriculum that we just looked at are all expressed throughout the subjects the students engage with. So those principles, the statements of learning and key skills. And those elements are no different for classics. The learning outcomes in the specification come from considering all of these things and making sure that they are represented in what the students will be doing in their classrooms every day. And they kind of underpin the learning across the whole specification. I want to take a minute to consider the aim and rationale of the subject. And to do so, I have pulled two quotes here from the specification that reflect for me the key message of what the subject aims to do. So Junior Cycle Classics, as a subject, it nourishes and develops the imaginative and creative side in students, as well as stimulating empathy and self-reflection. And it provides us with a portal through which we can investigate, experience, and reflect on the challenges and innovations, the ideas and ambitions of the seminal civilizations, without which our world would not be as it is today. So you can see from even reading these short extracts from the rationale and aim that the focus here is very much student-centered. It's about using the subject as a portal for students to develop their imagination and creativity, as well as encouraging them to use their learning in classics to view the world around them. So let's have a look at the structure of the course. You may be familiar with this design from the specification already. It represents the breakdown of the subject into its three strands. So strand 1, the core component, which will be taken by every student undertaking classics, and it is split into two sections, myth and daily life. Then, depending on the expertise and background of the teacher, students will explore one of the following two strands. Strand 2, classical studies component, which deals with the world of Achilles and Rome, the center of an empire. Or strand 3, the classical language component, where students will study either Latin or ancient Greek. There are two elements that run across all of the strands, and they are reading narratives and exploring representations, and exploring structures, patterns, and values and ideas. So as I mentioned, depending on the background of the teacher in the school, classics will look like one of these options posted here. Okay, so for example, I don't have a language background, so classics would look like this option on the screen here, where I would offer strand 1, myth and daily life, and strand 2, the world of Achilles and Rome, center of an empire, as classics. However, if you taught Latin or Greek, classics in your school would look like the option here on the right. Both called classics, both working from the same specification, and both sets of students will have the same core understanding of the subject as they will have experienced strand 1. The language students will use the core of the myth and daily life to explore their language and develop their language skills, while non-language students will use that core to expand daily life into looking at Rome and myth into looking at the world of Achilles and the Iliad. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the strands in a little more detail. So as I said, there are three strands. Strand 1 is broken down into myth and daily life. So myth, students will explore the culture and ideologies of civilizations through the lens of mythology. Daily life, through looking at daily routines and rituals of the everyday Greeks and Romans, students will gain an understanding and insight into their communities and the context of their mythology. Strand 2, so world of Achilles, students explore public life in the ancient world by looking at social dynamics of Greek epic through the lens of Homer's Iliad. And Rome, center of an empire, students explore history, politics, and public life through the lens of Rome's grand and complex urban landscape. Strand 3, then, a classical language. Students will learn either Latin or ancient Greek, and through it gain access to the literature, thought, and history of a civilization at the roots of Western culture. They learn to read, analyze, and appreciate Latin or ancient Greek texts, focusing on both the literary sphere of myth and the historical reality of daily life. Okay, so I want to pause here and take another quick poll to get a better understanding of the audience we have available here tonight and what strands they will be covering with their first years next September alongside Strand 1. So when I launch the poll, if you could tell me whether you're going to be covering Strand 2, World of Achilles and Rome, Capital of an Empire, Strand 3 with Latin as your chosen language, Strand 3 with Greek as your chosen language, or possibly the option here of you're not teaching Junior Cycle Classics next year. So I'm going to launch the poll now, and again, I will give you a few seconds to answer, and then we will have a look at the results. So that poll should be coming up on your screen now. And I'll give another few seconds to answer before closing it. Okay, I'm going to close it there. If we have a look at the results, 64% of you are going to be taking Strand 2, the Classical Studies component, while 36% of you will be taking Strand 3 and teaching Latin, but there's 0% of people taking Strand 3 with Greek at this webinar. So we're looking at teachers mainly dealing with the Classical Studies component and Latin in Strand 3. So thank you very much for answering that. If we have a look here, so the learning outcomes are the statements in the curriculum specifications to describe the knowledge, the understanding, skills and values students will be able to demonstrate after a period of learning. There are 58 learning outcomes across 3 strands of the Classic specification. Obviously, your students will only engage with the outcomes relevant to the strands that they are covering. They won't have to cover all 58 because they are across all 3 strands. And those outcomes are numbered to support teacher planning, and this does not suggest any kind of hierarchy or importance across them or indeed any chronology across them. They're just numbered to make it easier to sort through them. And if we have a look at the learning outcomes in a little more detail here, you will see how they are laid out across the strands. I have attached this learning outcomes poster as a handout in your taskbar. So if you want to, you can download a copy and you can keep it for your future planning. It's also available on jct.ie in the Classics section of the website. So if any of your colleagues couldn't make it this evening, they will be able to find a copy there for themselves. And if we look in a little bit closer detail at what the learning outcomes look like up close, I've taken this section here from Strand 1. And you'll notice in strands or in learning outcomes 1.11 to 115 that every learning outcome contains an action verb or sometimes more than one. And these action verbs are there to help support planning because they give us as the teacher an idea of what skills or actions students should be able to demonstrate in order to fulfill the learning outcomes. So I'm just going to take 1.14 as the example here. Okay, it actually contains 2 verbs. So students must collaborate, first of all, in order to achieve this outcome. So it's not to be done on their own. They're going to have to work with their classmates in some capacity to examine a selected occupation in the ancient world. When I looked at the glossary at the back of the specification, examine means to consider an object or concept in a way that uncovers its assumptions or interrelationships. So in this case, they're going to have to collaborate with their classmates to examine or to uncover the assumptions or interrelationships about an occupation that they have chosen to look at. So at this point, I want to pause for a second. And before I move on to dealing with planning a unit of learning and looking more closely at planning, I want to ask you if you have any questions relating to planning at this point. So maybe you have some questions about the process of planning that you would like answered. I've built in time at the end of this section when I've gone through the planning process to answer them, but if you could type them in now, that would be very, very helpful. And of course, if they occur to you as we go through the planning process, if you could put them in as well, and I will endeavour to answer as many of the questions as I possibly can. So with that, let's get started and have a look at the planning process. Okay, so the learning outcomes will clearly set out what students should know, understand, and be able to do as a result of the learning and teaching activities which they have undertaken during junior cycle. So the learning outcomes in junior cycle are very much focused on the student learning, and as underlined in the work here. Teachers will use the learning outcomes provided by subject or short course specifications as the starting point for planning a unit of learning and to develop learning intentions and success criteria to be shared and discussed with their students. Okay, so I'm going to be looking at planning a unit of learning now and how we would walk through that process. For this particular section, I am planning for a group who would be undertaking Strand 1 and 2 as their classics course, as this is where my experience is. But you will see that the planning is adaptable to students who are taking Strand 3 as well. And Erin Penn, a JCT associate for classics, has also offered a section at the end of this on planning around Strands 1 and 3. So there is pieces relevant to planning with Strand 3 as well. Okay, so I'm working from the suggested template, which is available on jct.ie. It's also attached in the handouts of this webinar, so you can download it for yourself. I want to take a moment to point out that this template is just a tool to help you get started on your planning journey. You may have a template that you already use that you find easier to work with, or you may want to adapt this to a format that suits the way you work, and that's perfectly acceptable. Okay. The same can be said of the unit of learning we're going to walk through now. This is only my interpretation of the learning outcomes. You may interpret them differently because your school context or your students' needs are different, and that is the thing that we need to consider most when we're planning. So what I'm doing here is just a suggested way of doing it. It's not necessarily the correct way, okay? So it's just a suggestion. So let's look at the stages of building a unit of learning. Okay, so if we're going to build our unit of learning, the foundation of every unit of learning is going to be the learning outcomes you've selected from the specification. Once you've selected your learning outcomes, you're going to consider the action verbs they contain, and that's going to guide you in what kind of activities or what kind of learning they'll have to demonstrate. Then you're going to break that learning outcome down into the key learning and ongoing assessment for this moment in time that the students are going to engage with. Then you're going to look at the learning experiences for students. And finally, when you've taught the unit or even throughout teaching it, you're going to reflect on what went well, what didn't work, and what you can build upon in this process going forward. Okay, so that's our stages there if we're building our unit of learning. So with that, I'm going to focus in on step 1 here. Okay, so the learning outcomes, and I have some suggestions of things we should consider or we could consider when selecting our learning outcomes to build our unit of learning. So we need to consider the stage the students are at in their learning journey, consider possible themes to focus our selection, look for meaningful integration across the strands and elements, and plan for meaningful and stimulating learning experiences. Okay, so considering those things, I decided I was going to plan for a first year group in term 1, so first year group in September. And considering here the stage they're at in their learning journey, I figured I would need an introduction to the subject and I would need to figure out if they had any prior knowledge. So I decided, given that they have no background, I was going to use the Greek gods as a way to introduce them to Greek culture and society and give them some foundational knowledge for mythology, because we were going to be looking at the gods and they're a prominent feature in different myths that we were going to explore in the future. So with that in mind, I selected the following learning outcomes. Okay, so 1.2, investigate how gods and goddesses and heroes and heroines are represented in visual sources. Investigate common religious beliefs, practices, daily rituals, considering their purpose and how they were experienced. Explore the motifs, themes, values, and messages of myths. Discuss the attitudes towards gender and sexual norms that myths reflect. And you'll notice that all of these strands, all of these learning outcomes come from strand 1. I've not made any links to the other strands because I could not find a meaningful way to integrate the knowledge at this point, as I'm only introducing them to these core concepts at this time. But I would look to build on this in future and link out to the other strands. Okay, the next thing I had a look at there was these learning outcomes represent the learning for 3 years. But at this moment in time, I am only focusing in on how gods and goddesses are represented in visual sources, because I'm not going to be looking at heroes. That's something I will revisit in a future unit of learning. And I'm only going to be looking at investigating common religious beliefs. I'm not going to be dealing with the rest of that learning outcome. So this is what I want to achieve in this moment in time, but the learning outcome is what's to be achieved over 3 years. So I'm going to revisit that at another point. Okay. And then the last thing I did there was investigate, explore, consider, and discuss. So I found my action verbs and I looked through them to give me an indication of the kinds of things the students will be able to demonstrate to me throughout this learning. So with all of that considered, my next step was to come up with the key learning for my students at this point. So a learning outcome represents what students will know, understand, and be able to do after 3 years, as I said just a second ago. The key learning is what I want them to be able to do or demonstrate at the end of this particular unit. So when my unit is finished in 5 or 6 weeks, what learning do the students need to be able to demonstrate? And the advice that I've given you is to consider the age and stage and prior knowledge of the group you're planning for. And what are the key things you think they should understand or know by the end of this unit? So I've broken my key learning here down into historical and geographical background of the ancient Greeks, explain the different stages of the creation myths, name the Olympian gods and recognize their images or symbols and be able to give a brief description of each of them and their origin story, chart the family tree of the gods, understand how the Greeks used the gods to explain the world around them. So for example, Aeolus and the winds, or Persephone and the seasons. Examine how the Greeks worshipped a god of their choosing. So what kind of offerings did they leave? What kind of temples would they have had? Investigate the kinds of stories the Greeks told about their gods, tell us anything about their beliefs as a society, and apply their learning of the gods to their own design. So once I had decided on what my key learning would be, so what I wanted to accomplish by the end of this unit, I considered how I would gather evidence of that. So what assessment would I use to gather evidence of that? So considering my key learning, what can the students say, make, write, or do to show that they have achieved this learning? What evidence am I using? And the assessment opportunities I went for here were to label major Greek city-states, religious and geographical sites on a map, explain the creation myth in their own words using a chosen format. So it could be video, poster, comic strip, it could be acting it out. Ability to match the gods' names and what they are the god of. So it could be done digitally as a Kahoot or a Quizlet. Match the symbols to a god's name. Presentation on their favorite god, explaining their origin and symbols, can be digital or it could be a poster. Hot seating. Fill in the family tree of the gods, okay? And knowing the story of Persephone and Aeolus, can they look at another god or another of the gods and their role and say what they think the Greeks would have used them to explain? Marketplace activity around how the ancient Greeks worshipped 6 different gods. Class discussions around the gods and what they might tell us, and apply their learning of the gods to their own design. Okay. There are plenty of other ways I could have gone about this. Again, these are just my interpretations. I've given multiple ways in which the learning could be demonstrated, but I'm going to ask for your input here. So do you have any additional assessments that you would use here considering the key learning? So is there anything else there that you would add in? So if you have a look into the question section of your toolbar and you can type in some suggestions of what you would use to assess this learning. So I've got one suggestion here of KWL, so know want to know and what I've learned. So you could do that with prior knowledge. What do they think they know about the gods already, and then get them to fill out what they've learned or what they want to know. Okay, thank you very much. Someone else has put in here, making and printing top trumps cards, and at the end the students design their own on a blank template. Okay, so they could pit the gods against each other using a top trumps card. Okay, very good, thank you. Okay, there's multiple different ways that you can gather evidence. So at its basic core, if you'll notice here, this is all formative assessment, okay? And formative assessment complemented by summative assessment will be a key feature of the new junior cycle. Okay, so there's lots of different ways we can assess our students. Possible examples there on the right. There's oral presentations, written work of different types, practical or designing and making activities, drama performances and projects. Okay, so the role of formative assessment is for us as teachers to gather evidence of student learning, and they can demonstrate that evidence in many different formats, and we can vary the way and we can look at the different ways that we use assessment with our students. So what kinds of things do you think you could do in your classroom to facilitate your key learning and your assessment opportunities? Okay, so possible learning experiences. I've only filled in 4 here. So marketplace activity, so set up a station with stimuli, written links to videos or websites dedicated to 5 gods or 6 and how their followers would have worshipped them in their temples, at their altars. Hot seating, students would assume the identity of one of the gods. Other students will ask them questions which they must answer from that god's perspective. Create a visual retelling of the creation in different formats, so acting, cartoons, finger puppets or lollipop stick puppets. Okay, there's loads of different options there. And then class discussions or class debates. Again, I've only put in 4 options here or 4 examples here, but I could have filled an entire webinar just going through examples of possible learning experiences. You will know best what works with your classes and with your students, and you should use that context of what they enjoy and where their interests lie to guide you and what your learning experiences could be. This comes down to how you're going to facilitate that learning in the classroom. Okay, the last stages will then vary from person to person, hence why I've left them empty here. So resources, what resources do you have available to you? So what worksheets, websites, videos, okay, so the top trumps cards, what do you have that you could use here to facilitate the learning? And then the reflection. So what went well, what could be improved next time? Going forward, if we're looking at this, it could be filled in at the end of the unit, or it could be filled in as you go through the unit, and just kind of giving yourself an idea as you go through, because this is a process we haven't planned for before, and it's important we're kind of keeping a track of what is working well for us and what's not working well for us, so we can build on our practice going forward. Okay, so when we put the pieces together, we have a suggestion for what a unit of learning might look like. So that's what you're seeing there if we put all the pieces together on the page. And at this point, I'm going to stop and I'm going to answer some of the questions that have come in over the few minutes while I've been going through those. Okay, so if you have any additional questions, please feel free to put them in while I'm answering these ones. So I have one question here around, can you cover a learning outcome more than once? Okay, it's a really good question. Of course is the answer. Okay, you can engage with learning outcomes more than once across the 3 years. You're building on your student knowledge and capacity, which changes and evolves over time. So how you engage with the same learning outcome in first year would be different to how you engage in third year. So you can definitely go back and build on that capacity again and again and again. So you can revisit the same learning outcomes. On the other side of that, it should be kind of noted that it's not the tick the box kind of exercise. You should be looking to build on student learning and development. And you see that when we look through sort of the long-term planning in a second. But it's that prior knowledge and constantly and reactivating things and building on what they already know. Okay, so thank you for that question. Any other questions coming in there? Okay. Do we have to plan this way? Okay. As I already pointed out, you should follow these overarching steps. Okay, so this is just a suggested template. Okay, but you should follow these sort of overarching steps, starting with the learning outcomes, the key learning, linking to assessment, but it doesn't have to use this template. But every junior cycle subject currently follows the same general pattern for planning, breaking it down into those steps. There's one here about, am I allowed to use any of my old prescribed texts under this new specification or syllabus? Okay, I'm assuming this pertains mostly to a language teacher. Okay, if you see that a text is relevant or it's a relevant example of the key learning that you're trying to achieve, that you've broken down from the learning outcomes, and you are using it to provide a meaningful learning experience to students, then of course you can use that text as a resource in your class. Okay, but it really would be about how you approach that text and what the purpose of it is, as long as it's related back to the learning outcomes and back to the learning you are trying to achieve and use it with. There's one here about, do we need to plan per class as well as per unit of learning? Overall, okay, so your unit of learning will be how you plan for breaking down the learning outcomes, but it will be up to you yourself if you want to break that down further again into your individual class plans or lesson plans. That's entirely up to you and how you like to plan and what format you like to plan in. So this represents your 5 to 6 weeks, what you want to achieve. How you break that down again into your daily classes and planning, that's entirely up to you and what you're used to. There's one here about could the language portfolio, the Latin language portfolio, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes anyway, include some material from Strand 1? Of course, definitely. If you're engaging with Strand 1 through your Latin language, then any work that you've done with that can be included in your Latin language portfolio. Okay. I am going to move on and keep moving. Anyone whose questions I didn't answer to this point, I'm very sorry, but I have built in more time at the end where I will address more questions. So I'm just going to move on for the minute and we will answer more questions shortly. Okay, implications for long-term planning. Okay, so the strands are designed to complement each other and not necessarily taken separately to each other. Okay, there will be times when your units of learning might solely be based off one strand, like the one I gave you before. Okay, however, where possible, teachers should look for a meaningful link between the strands and offer students a more optimized experience. And I'm going to keep going back to that word of meaningful link. Okay, it's about making that meaningful connection between the learning for students. Okay, but we also need to consider when we are planning in the longer term, what the long-term implications for the journey students are on. So if we think about this as a journey for students for a second, we need to see by what the learning outcomes represent, what they will need to know by the end of 3 years. Okay, so by the end of 3 years, we know that the target is that they will have engaged with all of the learning outcomes. But we also need to be aware that there are check-in points along the way. Okay, we have CBA 1 in second year and then CBA 2 in third year. And that links to particular areas of learning or learning outcomes. And we need to make sure that we've thought about that and how we are going to ensure that our students are prepared for those check-ins when they happen. Okay, so we need to think about this in the long term. And if we look at this student's journey a little more closely, and we can kind of think about this in terms of the implications it has on us for planning. So September 2019, first years begin engaging with the new specification. Okay, so I made my plan there for my first years for September. And that is based on the assumption that they have very little prior knowledge. So I was introducing concept and context. Okay. Moving on for that, CBA 1 for everyone is based on the learning outcomes relating to myth and storytelling. And that will happen sometime between January and May of 2021. So somewhere between January and May of second year. If we look then at CBA2, okay, CBA2 for students studying Strand 3 is a portfolio started in September 2019. So as that person who asked a question a moment ago, can they put stuff from Strand 1 into their language portfolio? Yes, of course, but it's also something we need to be aware of from September. Are we actually planning with the long-term goal for when they reach third year, they have their portfolio together? So it's something I need to be thinking of even when they're in first year. CBA2 for students studying Strand 2 is based on the learning outcomes relating to Rome, Centre of an Empire. Okay, so it's around a building in Rome. And that will happen somewhere between November and March 2021-2022. So somewhere between the November and March of third year. A week after that, okay, so a week after they undertake CBA2, they'll have to do the assessment task. And then in June 2022, we'll have the SEC written exam based on all learning outcomes in the specification. Okay, so those are the major check-in points that come across in this journey. Those check-in points need to be supported by the units of learning we plan across the strands in the long term. So if we have a look at a sample breakdown here of the years, of the 3 years and how we might plan here, okay? So this is just the year broken down into 5 segments, okay? I've put my introduction to the Greek gods unit of learning in the top corner there. And I've put in here, okay, so when we look at this part of the planning, working with the dates outlined, my school, okay, let's have a look at this as a hypothetical situation. If my school decided that CBA 1 for classics will take place in late March, early April of second year, I know that my students will need to have experienced myth and storytelling as a concept before that check-in so that they're prepared and have those skills. And I have to build my units of learning towards that point. So I need to know that they've experienced that up until that point. For CBA 2, okay, my school might decide that my students will undertake that in early November in third year. So again, this is something I need to think about when planning my units of learning, because I need to make sure that my students have engaged with the learning outcomes relevant to this CBA throughout second and first year, so that when they reach this check-in point that they're prepared for it. Okay. Okay. Why is making these connections important? Okay, well, page 15 of the classic specification says students' engagement and learning is optimized by a fully integrated experience across strand 1 and their other chosen strand. So we want to make those links between them because it builds on that knowledge to those points. So how do we link them? Okay, so we got to look for the links between all of them. So strand 1 and strand 2, or strand 1 and strand 3. Okay, so with that in consideration, so keeping all those elements in mind, I looked at how I could plan for both an integrated way across the strands that would build upon student learning as they went through it, and also keep in mind those future checkpoints. And this is what I came up with. And again, this is my interpretation of the learning outcomes. You might take a totally different approach, and you'll see in a moment I have an example from another teacher who I asked to plan the same thing, and they came up with something different again. So it's all about how you interpret the learning outcomes to your own context and to your students' need and your students' interests. But in this case, okay, my possible long-term connections between strand 1 and strand 2 were an introduction to the ancient religions, so who were the gods, the mythological background to the Trojan War and all of those interconnected stories, maybe a little bit on the Trojan War itself, and then looking at Aeneas and the wanderings before his founding of Rome, and a little bit of background to Roman mythology and introduction of the Roman gods. A look at Roman daily life with religious beliefs and practices, looking at Roman occupations and status in societies, so looking at the Vestal Virgins, priests, Roman soldiers, triumphal arches if we're looking at soldiers, linking that in there, excuse me, and the Arch of Titus as one of my three selected buildings from strand 3. Okay, Possible breakdown of the learning outcomes I would use to plan my units. Okay, so I looked at this once I decided where I thought my possible links across the strands would be. I then looked down and saw what learning outcomes I could connect to them. So these are the possible breakdowns of the learning outcomes, and in these units, again, you might choose a slightly different combination than what I would have, and that's perfectly acceptable, because in my mind, I kind of have an idea of what I would like to teach with this, and I was reading that into the learning outcomes, but you might see something totally different. But you can see here that I have woven the learning between the two strands to kind of help contextualize the learning for students and create a very meaningful experience that builds on capacity as it goes along. So I'll let you have a read of that for a second. Okay. I have just lifted those and put them into my plan. So they might fit into a plan like this. However, because I've never taught this course before, no one has, it hasn't come online yet, I wouldn't be planning a detailed unit of learning for each of these units until I was nearly finished with the previous one, because my introduction to the Greek gods might take a lot longer than I anticipated, or it might reveal something that I need to go back over. And I would leave space here to kind of chop and change as I go through and sort of slowly build capacity and slowly build my plans as I go through and I experience this process. Because remember, this is as much a journey for us as the teachers going through as it is for the students going through this learning journey. So it's something you'll want to change around and review, and I've left that reflection at the end of each box there. So reflecting on how it's going and how our planning is working so that we can move the process forward. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, another teacher undertook the same activity for me, but looked for links across strand 1 and strand 3, okay? And these were the suggestions that she made for possible links, okay? These links, from what I can read as well, would easily work for strand 1 and 2. So if she was to break down the learning herself, she would look for these connections as an introduction to the Greek gods and religion, an introduction to Athenian society, Greek mythology and heroes, Greek daily life, and the background to the Trojan War. This teacher is taking strand 1 and 3 and teaching ancient Greek as her language. And the possible breakdown of the learning outcomes in these units that she offered are as follows. Okay, and again, thank you very much to JCT Associate Erin Penn for making these suggestions for strand 1 and 3. I'll give you a second to read through them. Again, you could very easily take these same groupings and connect them between strands 1 and 2, looking at the Iliad as your Greek introduction to Greek society and look at it through that way, or heroes and daily life. It could easily work that way as well. And again, it's all about reading into these things and breaking the learning outcomes down in a way that works for you and works for your students and is guided by your own context. Okay, so what are the next steps for us as teachers? Okay, so where are our next steps? So familiarize yourself with the specification, and based on your experience today or at CPD events, consider the opportunities for student learning in the Classics specification within your school context. Collaborate with other teachers of Classics to develop further student-centered units of learning. Okay, so it might be a thing that you meet up with other teachers and go through that process. It works well as a collaborative process, and we learn more from each other sometimes by doing this together. It's very helpful. If you want additional information, okay, the framework for Junior Cycle 2015, the Junior Cycle Classics specification, I have attached a PDF copy of the Classics specification in the handout section of this, so you can feel free to download it as well, and you can have it there then to read through. Linked here as well are the NCCA Focus on Learning toolkits. These offer CPD for teachers, okay, so they're booklets you can download from the NCCA website, and they will give you support in the areas of learning intentions and success criteria, effective questioning, formative feedback, and students reflecting on their own learning. Okay, so you can download those for yourself if you want to work on any of those areas. Again, if you have any questions that need answered after this point or there's additional support, you can email info@jct.ie and we'll be able to help you in whatever specific way you need. Okay, answering questions about the Classics specification. So I've set aside some time here, so the last 10 minutes of this webinar, to deal with any questions that are arising. And I can see in the question bar here that there is a couple coming through. So I'm going to take a few minutes to deal with some of these. Again, I'm very sorry if I don't make it to your particular question, but I will follow up in an email if I don't answer it. And if there's anything else that comes up afterwards, you can feel free to email us. So I have one here about, does my school have to pick which strand we are going to engage with before we start in September, or can we change our mind halfway through? Okay, absolutely, yes, you would need to have that selected and start looking at your planning before you start in September or just before you start in September. I think I've brought it up a few times that you should be striving now to make those links between the strands, and they're not separate entities and they're not to be treated as separate. Myth and daily life would serve to give context to language learning, so they kind of offer a portal through which to learn the language. And same with non-language students, you'd be exploring the world of Achilles as links to both daily life and societal attitudes, and a rich theme of mythology that would complement strand 1. And Rome, capital of an empire, while it has fewer maybe mythological links, would definitely connect very strongly to the idea of daily life by exploring public spaces. So yes, in order to make those connections, I would say you'd really need to be very clear going in exactly what you are going to be teaching in terms of which strands you have selected. Okay, can I cover, can I cover all 3 strands within the same class? Okay, the strands are designed for 100 hours of engagement, so their whole classics course will only have 200 hours available to it. So it wouldn't really be possible to cover all 3 to the standard required within that time period. Okay, so with that being said, there's nothing saying you can't draw inspirations or aspects of the strands and use it to enrich the learning. Okay, so the Iliad, for example, okay, while it's related specifically to strand 2, if you were a teacher of Greek, you could use the myth of the Trojan War and maybe examples of Greek text as part of your language exploration. Okay, and that would also fit into strand 1, so it's mythology. Same if myself as a non-language teacher, when I'm teaching strand 2 and I'm teaching the Iliad, I would always use some Greek terminology like kleos and nemesis. So they can kind of influence each other, but you would only have 2 strands that you would be dealing with. Okay. My school wants to teach Latin and Greek, but we can only choose one as part of this course. Okay, very interesting question. Okay. Yes, you are correct that you can only choose Latin or Greek under the classics heading, so you'd have to choose one or the other as strand 3. Can I first off say it's great to see that your school would like to do both. The options that I could see for you with this particular problem would be either you could offer 2 classics classes, one where students cover strand 1 and strand 3 as Latin, and one where students cover strand 1 and strand 3 as Greek, or your students could study strands 1 and 3 possibly as Latin, and you and your school, so if you got your principal involved in this in consultation with the NCCA, you might want to develop your own short course in ancient Greek that is separate from the classics heading. Okay, so you might want to develop your own short course in Latin or Greek if that's something that your school is really committed to doing and you want to do both Latin and Greek languages. I have a question here about where I can find additional information about Classics CPD events. Okay, so you can download all the materials used in the CPD Day 1 on the website under Classics. So even if you've missed out on it, you can download it there. And it's worth pointing out the day will also be repeated in September as a second subject. So further details will be available about this shortly. But if you did miss out this year, you can avail of that training in September. Okay, and I will make sure that those details are available. Having a look here, in terms of the language portfolio, how many passages does JCT recommend students complete per month, per term? Obviously, the more they have in the language portfolio, the better, but is there a recommended structure? As it currently stands, there's no recommended structure for the language portfolio. It could be digital, it could be a physical folder. It's entirely at the disposal and the decision of the teacher. Where there will be assessment guidelines published for Junior Cycle Classics in the coming months, and that should offer some more guidance as towards the CBAs. Okay, and there will be training in future around the CBAs that will look in them in more depth once those assessment guidelines are available. So at this moment in time, there's no set number of passages that they have to complete per month or per term. It's entirely at the will of the teacher, and those assessment guidelines will make clearer what kind of items will be in your language portfolio. Okay. There's one here about what changes are there if you are doing Classics as a short course. So you can't take Classics as a short course in itself. You can't replace a subject with a short course. However, your school could develop their own short course with the NCCA based around maybe some of the elements of it. So like I said, if you language and you want to develop a Latin short course or possibly a short course on mythology, you would have to engage with the NCCA and design that short course, but you can't take Classics as it is as a short course as it stands. Classics is a full subject and it has a full 200-hour curricular engagement. In the event of a Classics subject inspection, would inspectors expect to see planning documents per unit of learning or per class? The inspector has seen that unit of learning plan. They're expecting to see a meaningful engagement with planning at a unit level. Your own personal leveling at class level is entirely up to you, but your units would provide that breakdown of your learning outcomes and what you plan to assess and your key learning. So again, adapt the planning to your own context and what works well for you. That unit of learning is a key thing that you would need to be planning for. No one should be covering 3 strands, 1 plus 2 for classical studies, 1 plus 3 for Greek or Latin. Yes, that is correct. Okay, so strand 1 and 2 or strand 1 and 3, you cannot cover all 3 of them. I have a question here about suggestions on differentiation, teaching a learning outcome to a mixed ability class. I suppose differentiation is going to depend on the students you have in front of you and what the abilities range is, and if there's specific special needs or additional needs that need to be met. So it would be a school and a local decision to work with, but definitely differentiation and making sure that we're offering a meaningful learning experience that all students can engage with is really, really important. So I'm really glad to see that people are thinking about differentiation and making sure that all of our students are provided an inclusive access to the specification. Okay, I don't see any more questions coming in at this point. Again, if there's anything additional you would like answered, please do so by emailing me, info@jct.ie. If there's any questions here that I have missed, I will email back to you, but going through the list there, I think I've addressed all of the ones that have come through. Can I finish off? I want to leave you one particular message, and that is, this is process, not perfection. Okay, you're at the beginning of this journey. So you will get better and you will develop as you go through this. It will get easier as you go through it, but it's going to take time and practice, and it's going to take going through those 3 years of this cycle, but we will offer as much support as possible. I want to thank you hugely for all tuning in this evening. I hope that you have found this helpful, and I look forward to working with you all in the future at different CPD events and at different events to do with classics over the next coming years. Okay, so thank you very, very much. You will be able to watch the webinar later on. It will be uploaded on jct.ie. It will also be attached in an email that will be sent to all participants. So thank you very, very much, and good evening.